The year is 2030. Let's say you're the top commander of a hostile superpower. You have the ships, you have the soldiers, you have the political will. And finally, you give the order. The United States of America will be invaded. But for this scenario, let's agree on one thing from the start. You're not worried about the American Navy. Actually, let's make it even simpler. Let's say the US military suddenly vanished. Poof, gone. No aircraft carriers, no Reaper drones, no Marines, no F-35s. Only the country remains, the land remains, the people remain, the infrastructure remains. And you say to yourself, all right, this is going to be easy. I'll plant my flag on the White House lawn within a month. But my friend, that is exactly where you're wrong. Because entering America is not an ordinary military operation. It means walking straight into one of the biggest logistical nightmares humanity has ever seen. Because America is not just a big country. America is like a massive fortress designed by nature itself for defense. The moment your boots touch the shore, if they even make it that far, you're no longer just fighting people. You're fighting physics. You're fighting economics. You're fighting geography. And most importantly, you're fighting millions of people who know their own neighborhood far better than you ever will. Today, we're not going to talk about nuclear weapons. We're not going to talk about F-35s either. We're going to set aside America's technological military superiority. Today, we're only going to look at one question. Why is America almost impossible to invade, even without its army? If you're ready, let's begin. Because this is going to get a little messy. The first issue, the oceans. In other words, America's two massive liquid walls. This is the first problem that can kill your invasion plan before it even begins. To the east, there is the Atlantic Ocean. To the west, there is the Pacific Ocean. These are not just huge bodies of water. For an army, they are basically logistical death sentences. If you're coming from Europe, you have to cross roughly 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers of open sea just to reach America's east coast. If you're coming from Asia, you're looking at nearly 10,000 kilometers to reach California. Now let's put that into perspective. During World War II, the Allies crossed the English Channel for the Normandy landings. That was a distance of only a few dozen kilometers in some places, the kind of distance where you can almost say, yeah, you can see the other side. But even for that landing, years of preparation were needed. Millions of tons of supplies were moved. The economic power of three major powers stood behind that operation. Now imagine the same thing. But this time the distance is not a few dozen kilometers. It is thousands of kilometers. And you don't need that distance just to move soldiers. You need it to move tanks, fuel, ammunition, food, field hospitals. In short, everything you need to invade a country. Let's say you're being very modest. You only want to land 500,000 soldiers in America. And even that is an incredibly small number for invading a continent-sized country with more than 330 million people. But fine, let's say 500,000 soldiers. You're not just transporting soldiers. Those soldiers need to eat every day. They need ammunition. They need medical support. They need vehicles. And most importantly, they need fuel. A modern armored unit can consume hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel per day on its own. So if you want to send an army across the middle of the Pacific toward America, you would almost need to build a bridge made of ships. And the funny part is this. There is no proper staging area right next to America that you can use. In most invasions, you first build up your forces in a nearby country. America used Britain before attacking Germany. Before entering Iraq, it benefited from regional bases such as Saudi Arabia. But if you're going to invade America, who are you going to use? Canada, Mexico, Hawaii. Even if you land in Hawaii, you are still thousands of kilometers away from the mainland. That's like gathering in London and trying to invade Iraq. So it doesn't help you as much as you think. And you can't hide an invasion force this large. Everyone would see those ships being prepared. Activity would begin in the ports. Satellite images would catch you. Commercial routes would change. Even insurance markets would panic. So there is no such thing as sneaking up on America. By the time you are still loading soldiers onto ships, the other side has already shifted into a war economy. By the time your first ship reaches American shores, your soldiers will have spent weeks at sea, seasick, their muscles weakened from lack of movement, their morale low, eating packaged military meals non-stop. And when they finally reach the coast, what greets them? A welcome banner? No. Because American coastlines are not designed as places where you can just come on in and land comfortably. The West Coast is largely rocky, harsh, and full of dangerous currents. There are only a limited number of deep water ports where you can unload heavy armored vehicles. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Diego. A few critical points, and each one of them is also a bottleneck. If the defenders sink a few cargo ships at the harbor entrance, if they blow up the cranes, if they disable the container terminals, then you become an easy target while trying to unload your tanks onto the beach. The East Coast is not much easier either. There are shallow waters. There are swampy areas. There is extremely dense urbanization. So the moment you step onto the shore, you find yourself inside a concrete jungle. In short, America's first line of defense is not its army, it is its geography, and that geography has no mercy for an invader. Now let's say you don't think the ocean problem is that big of a deal. All right, you say. I don't have to enter America directly by sea. I'll land in Canada or Mexico first, then move in by land. Sounds logical, right? Actually, no. Because at that point, you've just walked into an even bigger problem. Let's start with the north. Canada. Let's say you land in Canada. Great. Welcome to the Canadian Shield. If you're not too familiar with geology, the Canadian Shield is basically a massive natural obstacle made up of huge rocky areas, swamps, thousands of lakes, dense forests, and freezing cold. In other words, it is one of the most unpleasant places on Earth for mechanized warfare. If you want to move tanks, armored vehicles, and large convoys, you need wide roads, strong bridges, fuel lines, and proper infrastructure. But in northern Canada, most of that simply does not exist, because barely anyone lives there. Why? Because it is extremely cold. The ground is brutally hard. The distances are enormous. And nature is constantly telling you, do not come this way. Let's say you land in Vancouver and try to move down along the west coast. This time, the Cascade Mountains squeeze you into narrow passes. That means your entire army is forced into a handful of roads. In places like that, the defender does not need a massive army. They only need to destroy a few critical points. One bridge goes down. One tunnel gets blocked. One mountainside collapses in a controlled demolition. And suddenly your miles-long convoy turns into one giant traffic jam. So what if you come from the east? Let's say you try to move in through Halifax or Montreal. This time, you run into the dense forests, brutal winters, and Appalachian terrain of New England. Throughout history, winter has ruined massive armies. Napoleon learned that in Russia. Hitler learned that in Russia too. And North American winters are not something you can just shrug off either. Fuel freezes, vehicles break down, roads shut down. When spring comes, the ground turns into mud. And while all of this is happening, you're not just trying to enter America. You're also trying to keep a massive country like Canada under control. So before you even reach the American border, you already have a second occupation problem on your hands. All right, the north didn't work. Then let's look south. Let's enter through Mexico. At first glance, that might sound reasonable too. But down there, the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts are waiting for you. This is not just a matter of some hot sand. This is terrain that can kill people who are simply trying to walk through it with a backpack. There is little water, little shade, huge distances, brutal heat. Now imagine trying to do that with tanks, trucks, ammunition, fuel tankers, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But there is an even bigger problem than the terrain: the logistics of the border. The US-Mexico border is roughly 3,200 kilometers long, but that does not mean you can comfortably drive tanks across every part of it. In some areas, the Rio Grande acts like a natural trench. Some places may look easy to cross, but there is no infrastructure. Other areas are in the middle of deserts, mountains, and empty wilderness. And when you cross the border, you are still not in the heart of America. You are entering places like Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Huge, spread-out areas. The distances here are hard to wrap your head around. Let's say you enter through El Paso. Chicago is still roughly 2,200 kilometers away. Washington, D.C. is also thousands of kilometers ahead. So crossing the border does not mean the war is over. The real long march has just begun. And you have to cross all that distance through exposed desert terrain, with supply lines stretching farther and farther behind you. There are no dense clusters of cities along the way that you can easily loot or use. Major cities are hundreds of kilometers apart. That means everything your army needs has to come from the rear. Fuel has to come from the rear. Food has to come from the rear. Ammunition has to come from the rear. Spare parts have to come from the rear. And that rear is a vulnerable supply line stretching for thousands of kilometers. Then there's the fuel problem. Trucks need fuel. Tanks need fuel. Armored vehicles need fuel. Helicopters need fuel. So where are you going to get all that fuel? America is one of the largest oil producers in the world. But a country under invasion is not going to hand you its refineries in perfect condition. Refineries in Texas would be hit. Pipelines would be shut down. Oil fields would be sabotaged. And you would find yourself in the middle of the desert in a war zone with no gas stations. Historically, most large invasions were not lost only on the battlefield. They were lost through logistics. Napoleon experienced this in Russia. The Nazis experienced this in Russia. And in different ways, the same lesson was repeated in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Keeping an army supplied in a distant place is even harder than getting that army there in the first place. Trying to enter America through Canada or Mexico gives you exactly that problem. It gives you the longest, weakest, and most exposed supply lines in history. And on top of that, before even attacking America properly, you would basically have to control Canada or Mexico first. That alone could mean years of war. And while you are busy with all of that, America is not just sitting around. It fortifies the borders. It blocks the roads. It mines the passes. It prepares the bridges. It builds defensive lines. So yes, maybe you reach the continent. But reaching America's vital organs is a completely different story. You have entered the outer edge, but you are still very far from the heart of the country. Now let's say you somehow manage all of that. You cross the ocean. You get past the Canadian forest. You survive the Mexican deserts. Somehow you establish a solid landing point on the American coast. You look at the map with your generals and say, "All right, the hardest part is over." No, the hardest part has not even started yet, because now you have to deal with America's internal geography, the mountains. If you entered from the west coast and look east, you will see a giant wall in front of you, the Rocky Mountains, a massive mountain chain stretching from Canada all the way down to New Mexico, roughly 4,800 kilometers long. In some places, it is hundreds of kilometers wide. Its peaks rise above 4,000 meters. And moving a large army through those mountains is not as easy as drawing an arrow on a map. Yes, there are roads, there are passes, there are tunnels, but that is exactly the problem. Because those roads, passes, and tunnels are limited, that means your army is forced into specific points. Take Interstate 70 in Colorado, for example. From an engineering perspective, it is an amazing road, but from a defensive warfare perspective, it is a nightmare for an invader. One tunnel gets blown up. One bridge is dropped. One canyon road is blocked. and your multi-billion-dollar invasion force turns into a giant parking lot in the middle of the mountains. And who is up there above you? People who know the region like the back of their hand. Hunters, veterans, locals who know the mountain roads, valleys, and trails. While you are trying to move in a convoy, they are watching from above. You cannot see them, but they can see you. This is no longer a classic frontline war. It turns into something like Afghanistan, but much bigger, much richer, and much more heavily armed. The Soviets spent 10 years trying to control the mountains of Afghanistan. The Americans struggled with similar terrain for years as well. The Rocky Mountains are larger, wider, and far more brutal as defensive terrain. The weather changes, roads freeze, vehicles slide off cliffs, fuel trucks get hit. And at every pass you bleed a little more. So maybe you say the West Coast is a trap. Fine, let's enter from the east. New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. Let's assume you capture the coastal cities. You enter Manhattan, you reach D.C. All right. But now you have to move inland, toward the country's agriculture, energy, and real production centers. And this time, the Appalachian Mountains stand in your way. They are not as tall as the Rockies, but that does not make them easy. The Appalachian region is a forest-covered, valley-filled, frustrating nightmare for armored vehicles. It stretches from Alabama all the way up to Maine. It stands like a natural barrier between the East Coast and the Midwest. Historically, this region has always been a problem for outside powers. In the 18th century, the British Empire had one of the strongest militaries on Earth. But even they struggled to project power through these mountains, forests, and valleys. Because in terrain like this, the advantage of a large army starts to shrink, and the advantage of the local defender grows. Roads get narrow. Vehicles are forced into predictable routes, and once a road becomes predictable, it becomes dangerous. Every bend can be an ambush. Every bridge can be a target. Every tunnel can become a tomb. Imagine driving a convoy through the valleys of West Virginia or Kentucky. The road is below, the hills rise on both sides, trees block your view. You cannot see the enemy, but the enemy can see you. In the deserts of Iraq, you can see for kilometers. Here, sometimes you cannot even see 100 meters ahead. Even if you have air support, it is hard to know who is where under the tree cover. So once again, you are dragged into close-range, exhausting, grinding infantry warfare. And the people facing you may have been hunting in these woods since childhood. America's geography basically works like this. There is a giant inner fortress in the middle, the Mississippi Basin. One of the most critical regions of the country in terms of agriculture, energy, transportation, and production. But to reach that inner fortress, you first have to cross two massive natural walls, the Rocky Mountains in the west, the Appalachians in the east. So if you want to reach America's heart, you first have to get through the castle walls. And those walls are not made of stone. They are made of mountains, forests, canyons, tunnels, bridges, and armed people waiting for you. So far, we've talked about land, mountains, deserts, oceans, but now we get to maybe the most dangerous part of the whole equation: the people. Because if you try to invade America, you are not just fighting geography. You are fighting millions of civilians, and a lot of them are armed. There's a famous quote often attributed to Japanese Admiral Yamamoto: "You cannot invade mainland America. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, but the idea is not wrong. America has hundreds of millions of civilian-owned firearms, not a few million, hundreds of millions. Many estimates suggest there are more guns than people in the country. That does not mean every person is walking around armed, but it does mean the weapons are already spread across the country. Handguns, shotguns, AR-15 style rifles, long-range hunting rifles, and more importantly, people who know how to use them. Think about hunting culture alone. In some states, hundreds of thousands of people go into the woods every season. They may not be soldiers, but they know the terrain. They know how to move quietly. They know how to track. They know how to shoot. Now add veterans, police officers, security workers, gun owners, rural communities, people who grew up around firearms, trucks, tools, workshops, drones, and back roads. For an occupying army, this stops being a normal war. Every town becomes a problem. Every neighborhood becomes a possible front line. Every farm road becomes a possible ambush. You might say, fine, they're civilians, I have tanks. Sure, but tanks do not solve everything. Vietnam proved that. Afghanistan proved that. Iraq proved that. A motivated resistance that knows the terrain can bleed a much larger army for years. And an American resistance would have something most insurgencies never had at this scale: weapons, ammunition, vehicles, drones, workshops, internet knowledge, and millions of people with military experience. That last part matters a lot. America has spent much of the last few decades involved in war, so the country has millions of veterans. Some have seen combat, some understand logistics, some know communications, some know patrols, ambushes, convoy security, and how modern military systems actually work. Now imagine occupying a small town in Missouri. You set up a checkpoint. You park a few armored vehicles. You think the road is secure. Then a supply truck hits a mine. Before your soldiers even understand what happened, a cheap commercial drone flies overhead and drops an explosive. Then shots come from 3 different directions. You try to respond, but the attackers are already gone. They disappear into suburbs, cornfields, woods, garages, basements, farm roads. There is no clear front line, no obvious enemy you can circle on a map. Today they hit you here, tomorrow they appear somewhere else. That is the nightmare of occupying a country like America. Even if the capital falls, the war does not end. Let's say you capture Washington, D.C. Then what? Does Texas surrender? Does California give up? What about Florida, Ohio, Montana, Alaska? America is not controlled by one central switch. It has states, counties, sheriffs, local governments, National Guard units, and thousands of communities with their own identity, terrain, and pride. This is not a system where you cut off the head and the body collapses. If anything, capturing the capital might make the rest of the country fight harder. The resistance would not be one clean organization. It would be local, every state in its own way, every county on its own roads, every town around its own bridges, every neighborhood as its own small fortress. And that is where occupation becomes impossible. Because occupation is not just about winning battles. You have to govern. You have to guard streets, bridges, power plants, ports, railways, fuel stations, convoys, city halls. For a country with more than 330 million people, that means millions of occupation troops, and you do not have that many. No one does. While you guard one bridge, another goes down. While you control one town, another rises up. While you reopen one supply route, another convoy gets hit behind you. That is what a rifle behind every blade of grass really means. Not a literal rifle everywhere. Constant uncertainty everywhere. A pickup truck could be a threat. A barn could be a threat. An empty house could be a threat. A bend in the road could be a threat. A package under a bridge could be a threat. So invading America is not just fighting an army. It is fighting the people, the gun culture, the veterans, the local identities, the suburbs, the forests, the back roads, and the geography all at once. For any invader, that becomes a complete nightmare. All right, people are shooting at you. Mountains are blocking your way. Oceans are isolating you. But let's say you are still moving forward. Maybe you think, America has advanced infrastructure, roads, bridges, railways. If I capture them, I can use them. Sounds logical, but that is the trap. America's infrastructure was built for commerce, not conquest. In peacetime, it moves the whole country. Goods, people, fuel, food, money, everything. But in wartime, for an invader, that same system becomes a giant machine full of weak points. Start with distance. America is massive. Driving from New York to Los Angeles takes more than 40 hours non-stop. And that is with open roads, working bridges, no traffic, and nobody trying to kill you. In a war zone, none of that survives. One road gets blocked, one bridge goes down, one tunnel collapses, one convoy gets hit. Suddenly, a trip that should take 2 days can stretch into weeks or months. The interstate highway system is the backbone of the country. But for an invader, it has one huge weakness: bridges. There are hundreds of thousands of bridges in the United States. Defenders do not need to destroy every road. They only need to drop the right bridges, especially the crossings over the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers. Do that, and movement across the country starts falling apart. The Mississippi is especially important. It is one of the main arteries of the continent, a massive natural line cutting through America's interior. If key bridges over that river are gone, you still have to cross. But this is not a small stream. In some places it is kilometers wide, with powerful currents. Now imagine building a pontoon bridge while people are shooting from the other side. Your engineers are working. Your vehicles are lined up. Your soldiers are standing in the open. For the defenders, that is a perfect target. Americans can adapt because they know their own river systems, the boats, the barges, the ramps, the crossings, the back routes. But you are the invader. You have to learn all of that under fire. And in war, trial and error is expensive. Then come the railways. America has one of the strongest freight rail systems in the world. On paper, that sounds useful. Capture the rails. Move supplies by train. Simple, right? Not really. The network is enormous, complex, and dependent on switches, signals, tunnels, locomotives, operators, and private infrastructure. If defenders sabotage a few key switching points, disable locomotives, damage tunnels, or crash signaling systems, the entire network can freeze. So, you fall back on trucks. But trucks bring another nightmare. They need fuel, tires, drivers, maintenance, spare parts, and safe roads. Moving a tank to the front is hard. But feeding that tank with fuel, ammunition, food, and repairs every single day is harder. Especially when the distance is not hundreds of kilometers. It is thousands. The deeper you move into America, the farther you get from the coast. And the farther you are from your ports, the weaker your supply line becomes. At some point you realize the truth. You are not getting stronger as you advance. You are getting weaker. Your front line grows. The roads you must protect multiply. Your trucks burn more fuel. Your dependence on bridges increases, and more of your soldiers are pulled away from fighting just to guard supply routes. Meanwhile, the defenders are at home. They know the fuel depots, the alternate roads, the rural crossings, the bridges that actually matter. You are reading the terrain. They are living inside it. Then comes oil and energy. America has reserves, refineries, pipelines, power grids, and massive energy infrastructure. But in an invasion, assuming those assets will be handed to you intact is fantasy. Refineries burn, pipelines shut down, power lines are cut, distribution centers are sabotaged, fuel depots are emptied or destroyed. And now you are in the middle of Kansas, thousands of kilometers from the ocean, with vehicles running on empty. In front of you, a destroyed bridge. Behind you, an angry farmer. To your right, a railway that no longer works. To your left, hundreds of trucks waiting for fuel. That is America's internal logistical black hole. The deeper you go, the weaker you get. Every dependency becomes a target. A bridge, a transformer, a rail switch, a fuel tanker, a warehouse, a tunnel, a highway junction. Each one looks small. Together, they are the veins of your invasion force. And once those veins are cut, your army does not die at the front. It dies on the road. America's infrastructure does not give you a shortcut to victory. If defenders decide to break it, it becomes a swamp that pulls you in. On the map, your arrows move forward. In real life, behind those arrows is a fragile supply line stretching for thousands of kilometers, and when that line breaks, even the strongest tank becomes an expensive piece of metal. Now let's step away from the battlefield. Let's say you somehow survive all of this. You cross the oceans, you pass the mountains, you survive the armed civilians, you repair the bridges, you keep the tanks fueled, and you actually start making progress. Congratulations. Now you have pushed the world toward an economic cliff. And not just America, yourself too. Because America is not just a large country, it is one of the key pieces of the global economy. In some ways, it works like the operating system of the modern world. Start with the dollar. The US dollar is the world's main reserve currency. A huge amount of global trade runs through it. Oil, gold, commodities, debt, international payments. In many parts of the world, the language of money is the dollar. So if America destabilizes, the dollar shakes. Markets panic, banks freeze. Nobody knows what anything is worth. At first you might think, great, my rival's currency is collapsing. But then you remember something: your own banks hold dollar assets. Your company's borrowed in dollars. Your central bank holds dollar reserves. Your trade also depends on this system. So while trying to blow up America, you blow up part of your own vault. It is like burning your enemy's house and realizing your money was inside. Then there is technology. A huge part of the world's digital infrastructure is tied to American companies. Cloud systems, data centers, cybersecurity, financial networks, satellite connections, software platforms. If you attack America, you are not just attacking land. You are shaking systems that you also use. Hit data centers in Virginia, and maybe you hurt American internet. But you may also damage your own banks, companies, logistics, and military communications. The modern world is more connected than people like to admit. You cut a cable in America. You feel it in your own capital. And then there is human capital. Silicon Valley is not just buildings. Technology companies are not just offices. The real value is in people, engineers, scientists, programmers, researchers, source code, encryption keys, system architecture, data sets. If America is being invaded, that knowledge does not just sit there waiting for you. People flee, systems shut down, data disappears, access gets locked. You might enter Silicon Valley and find empty offices and dead servers. Because the value was never really the land. It was the people, the systems, and the knowledge. So invading America is not just crossing a border. It is taking an axe to the nervous system of the global economy. And you are connected to that system too. Even if it looks like you are winning, you may be pushing your own economy off a cliff. It is like shooting the pilot of a plane you are also sitting in. The pilot goes down, but so does the plane, and you are still inside. Finally, let's talk about the part that sounds boring, but may be the most important: governing. Because invading a country is hard, but governing it is much harder, especially if that country is America. From the outside, America looks like one country, but from the inside, it is not that simple. This is not a place controlled by one central button. America is, to exaggerate a little, like 50 separate countries in a trench coat saying, "We are one nation." States, governors, counties, sheriffs, local police, state laws, thousands of power structures with their own authority and pride. In some countries, you capture the capital, remove the leader, and the system falls in line. America does not work that way. Imagine you capture Washington, D.C. You enter the White House. You control the capital. You mark capital captured on the map. Then what? Does Texas obey you? Does California give up? What about Florida, Alaska, Montana, or Ohio? Probably not. Because in America, daily life already runs at the local level. Police are local. Sheriffs are local. Schools are local. Many laws are state level. National Guard units are tied to the states. So even if you capture the federal capital, you do not automatically control the country. That is where the real nightmare begins. You are not trying to defeat one government. You are trying to control 50 states, thousands of counties, and hundreds of millions of people who do not want you there. And American culture is already comfortable arguing with authority. Now imagine a foreign occupier saying, "These are the rules now." You do not just get armed resistance, you get work slowdowns, sabotage, strikes, civil disobedience, wrong information, lost documents, systems that suddenly stop working. Everything looks normal on paper, but nothing works properly. And you cannot solve that with a tank. You cannot guard every power plant, bridge, warehouse, junction, and town hall. The more you try to govern a country this large, the poorer you become. You spend more trying to control America than you could ever hope to gain. It becomes a negative-sum game. The longer you stay, the more you bleed. Now put the whole picture together. To invade America, you first cross the oceans, then you fight through the coast, the ports, Canada, Mexico, mountains, deserts, armed civilians, and collapsing supply lines. The deeper you enter, the weaker you become. Then comes the economy. Destabilizing America does not only hit America, it hits the dollar, global trade, technology, financial networks, and eventually you too. And finally, there is government. Capturing Washington, D.C. does not mean capturing America. There is no single switch you can turn off. Every region can resist in its own way. That is why invading America stops being a normal military operation. It becomes a suicide note. Logistically close to impossible. Geographically nightmarish. Economically destructive. Politically ungovernable. And socially ready to explode. America is not hard to invade only because of its army. The land itself is part of the defense. The Atlantic and Pacific are the walls. The Rockies and Appalachians are the towers. The Mississippi is the inner fortress. And the people are the garrison that never sleeps. So if any superpower is making a plan like this, the question is not, are you brave enough? The question is, can you pay the price? And the answer is probably no. Because taking America is one thing, holding it is something else entirely. Not entering the country, staying in it. At some point, the occupying army is no longer the force defeating America. It becomes the force slowly dissolving inside it. In short, attacking America is one thing. Taking America is another. But governing America, that is a whole different nightmare.